there's something quietly fascinating about the Roman Empire. Not just in what it was, but in how much of it still feels unresolved. Not in a dramatic or conspiratorial way, but in a subtle, almost background sense. Like a structure you've seen 100 times, but never really examined closely. Tonight, we're going to move slowly through that structure, not trying to force answers, but simply observing what's there, what we know for certain, and where the edges begin to blur into uncertainty. And before we go further, if you find yourself drawn to this kind of calm, thoughtful exploration, consider subscribing and let me know where you're listening from. It's always interesting to see how far these quiet late-night conversations travel across different cities, different time zones, all connected by curiosity. When most people think about the Roman Empire, the mainstream understanding is clear and well established. It began as a small city-state in Rome, gradually expanding through military strength, political strategy, and economic organization, until it controlled vast territories across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Historians point to structured governance, disciplined legions, advanced engineering, and a flexible approach to integrating conquered peoples as the key reasons for its success. Roads, aqueducts, legal systems. These are often presented as the foundation of Roman dominance. And on the surface, that explanation works. It's logical, supported by evidence, and consistent with what we see in surviving ruins and written records. But even within that framework, there are small details that invite a closer look. Not contradictions exactly, more like areas where the story feels incomplete or perhaps too smooth. Because when you step back and consider the scale of what Rome achieved, especially given the technological limitations of the ancient world, it begins to raise quiet questions. Not dramatic ones, just the kind that sit in the background and slowly become more noticeable the longer you think about them. Take, for example, the speed of expansion. Within a few centuries, Rome went from a regional power to controlling millions of square kilometers. The standard explanation is military efficiency combined with political adaptability. And that's true. Roman legions were highly organized, their tactics well documented, their discipline unmatched in many cases. But expansion at that scale also requires something less visible: coordination. Communication across vast distances, supply chains that function reliably over months or years, decision-making that remains consistent even when information travels slowly. All of this is acknowledged in mainstream history, but often not deeply examined. Because if you imagine managing an empire without modern communication, without instant updates or centralized digital systems, it becomes clear that Rome's administrative structure had to be not just effective, but remarkably resilient. Messages carried by horseback or ship, governors making decisions with limited oversight. Yet somehow the system held together for centuries. Not perfectly, of course, but well enough to maintain control over diverse regions with different languages, cultures, and priorities. And this is where things begin to feel interesting. Because the Roman system wasn't just about force. In many cases, it was about integration. Conquered peoples weren't always suppressed. They were often absorbed. Local elites were incorporated into Roman governance. Citizenship was gradually extended. Infrastructure was built to connect distant territories back to the center. The empire didn't just expand outward. It pulled everything inward, creating a kind of network that was both political and cultural. Mainstream historians explain this as a strategic choice, a practical way to reduce resistance and maintain stability. And again, that makes sense. But it also suggests a level of long-term planning that feels unusually consistent, not just across decades, but across generations. Leaders changed, policies shifted, crises emerged, yet the overall direction remained surprisingly stable for long periods of time. which raises a subtle question. Not about whether Rome was effective, but about how that effectiveness was maintained. Because in most historical systems, especially large ones, fragmentation tends to happen quickly. Power struggles, regional independence, communication breakdowns. These are common patterns, and Rome did experience these things, especially later in its history. But for a significant stretch of time, the system functioned with a kind of quiet continuity that feels almost understated in how it's usually described. And then there's the infrastructure itself. Roman roads are often mentioned as a symbol of their engineering skill. Straight, durable, connecting distant parts of the empire. Built with layers of materials designed to last, many of them still visible today. The standard explanation is that these roads were constructed using known techniques, organized labor, and military precision, which is true. But again, the scale invites a second look. Thousands of miles of roads built across varied terrain, mountains, forests, deserts, all aligned with a broader network that allowed for relatively efficient movement of troops and goods. Not just built, but maintained over time. And not in isolation. These roads connected to cities, ports, supply depots, forming a system that functioned as a whole. It's not that this is impossible. Clearly it was done. But when you consider the coordination required, the planning, the resource allocation, the consistency of design, it suggests a level of organizational capability that feels in some ways ahead of what we might expect from that period. And then there are the cities. Roman urban planning followed recognizable patterns: grids, public spaces, water systems, sanitation. The presence of aqueducts alone is often highlighted as evidence of their engineering knowledge. Water transported over long distances with precise gradients, maintaining flow without modern pumps. Again, the explanation is well understood: gravity, careful measurement, skilled construction. But when you look at multiple aqueduct systems across different regions, built at different times, yet following similar principles, it points to a shared body of knowledge that was not only developed, but preserved and transmitted effectively. Not just within a single generation, but across centuries. And this is where a more speculative angle begins to emerge. Not as a claim, but as a question. How was knowledge preserved in a world without printing presses, without widespread literacy, without centralized education systems as we understand them today? Yes, there were schools, scholars, written texts, but the consistency of certain engineering and administrative practices suggests something more structured beneath the surface. Perhaps it was simply the result of disciplined record-keeping and apprenticeship. Knowledge passed from master to student, from one generation to the next. That's the mainstream view, and it holds up in many ways. But it also leaves open the possibility that there were systems of knowledge management that we don't fully understand, or that haven't survived in a complete form. Not hidden knowledge, just lost context. And then, of course, there's the transition from republic to empire. The rise of Augustus is often presented as a turning point, a shift from a system of shared governance to centralized authority. Officially, the republic ended, but many of its structures remained, at least on the surface. Power was consolidated, but presented as continuity. Mainstream historians describe this as a careful political strategy, Augustus maintaining the appearance of republican values while effectively holding imperial power. And again, that explanation is supported by historical sources, but it also introduces an interesting dynamic, a system that operates in one way while presenting itself as something slightly different. Not deception in a dramatic sense, more like controlled perception. And that idea, the difference between how a system functions and how it presents itself, is something that appears repeatedly in Roman history, not as a secret, but as a pattern. Titles that imply shared authority, structures that suggest balance, all existing alongside a reality that is more centralized than it appears. Which brings us back to the broader question, not whether the Roman Empire was powerful, that's well established, but how it maintained that power with such consistency across such a vast and diverse landscape for as long as it did. The mainstream explanations provide a solid foundation: military strength, political strategy, infrastructure, integration. But when you look closely, there are layers within those explanations that feel deeper than they're usually explored. Not mysterious in a dramatic sense, just complex in a way that invites further thought. And that's where we'll continue, slowly moving through different aspects of the empire, not trying to solve anything all at once, just observing patterns, comparing perspectives, and allowing the details to settle into place over time. As we continue, it helps to slow the pace even further, not to rush toward conclusions, but to sit with the structure of the empire itself and begin looking at one of its most defining features, something so common in discussions of Rome that it's almost taken for granted: the Roman legion. Because in the mainstream view, the power of the Roman Empire is inseparable from its military. The legions are described as disciplined, adaptable, and highly organized, a professional fighting force that evolved over time, learning from both victories and defeats. This explanation is supported by historical accounts, archaeological findings, and surviving records of tactics and formations. It's one of the more concrete parts of Roman history, something that feels solid, well understood. And yet, even here, when you take a step back, there are details that begin to feel worth examining more closely. A Roman legion was not just a group of soldiers, it was a system. Thousands of men organized into precise units, each with defined roles, responsibilities, and command structures. Training was standardized, equipment was relatively uniform. Discipline was enforced not just through punishment, but through a shared identity, a sense of belonging to something larger than the individual. These are all known factors, and they explain a lot about why Roman armies were effective. But effectiveness on a battlefield is one thing. Consistency over centuries is something else entirely. Because the Roman military didn't just win battles, it maintained a recognizable structure for generations. Reforms happened, of course, especially during periods of crisis. But the core idea of the legion remained surprisingly stable. This suggests not just strong leadership at specific moments, but a system that could reproduce itself reliably over time. Training new soldiers, promoting officers, maintaining discipline across different regions. All of this had to function continuously, not just during peak periods. And this leads to a quiet but interesting question. How do you maintain that level of consistency in a world where communication is slow, where cultural differences are significant, and where local conditions vary widely? The mainstream answer points again to structure and tradition. Roman military practices were documented, taught, and reinforced through repetition. Veterans trained new recruits. Officers followed established procedures. Over time, these practices became embedded in the system itself. And that makes sense. It's how many institutions preserve continuity. But when you imagine this happening across the entire empire, from the forests of northern Europe to the deserts of North Africa, it becomes clear that this wasn't just a matter of repeating instructions. It required adaptation without losing identity, flexibility within a rigid framework, and that balance between structure and adaptability is something that appears repeatedly in Roman systems. The legions could adjust their tactics depending on the enemy. They learned from encounters with different cultures, incorporating new methods when necessary. At the same time, they maintained a core identity that remained distinctly Roman. This duality is often mentioned in historical analysis, but rarely explored in depth as a pattern across multiple aspects of the empire. Because if you look beyond the military, you begin to see similar dynamics in governance, law, and even culture. Take Roman law, for example. It's often described as one of Rome's most lasting contributions, a system of rules and principles that influenced legal traditions long after the empire itself declined. The mainstream explanation is that Roman law evolved over time, becoming more sophisticated as the empire expanded. Legal codes were developed, refined, and applied across different regions, creating a sense of order and predictability. And again, that explanation works. But here too, there's an underlying question about transmission and consistency. How do you apply a legal system across such a wide and diverse territory, especially when local customs and traditions differ significantly? How do you ensure that laws are interpreted in a relatively uniform way, when the people enforcing them may come from entirely different cultural backgrounds? The standard answer involves a combination of centralized authority and local administration. Governors, magistrates, and legal experts were responsible for applying Roman law, often adapting it to local conditions when necessary. Over time, a body of legal knowledge developed, something that could be referenced and taught. But this raises another subtle point: the existence of a shared legal language. Not just in the literal sense of Latin, but in the conceptual sense. A way of thinking about rules, rights, and responsibilities that could be understood across different regions. This kind of shared framework doesn't appear instantly. It develops over time, and it requires a certain level of intellectual consistency. Which brings us to education. In the mainstream view, education in the Roman world was not universal, but it was valued, especially among the elite. Children of wealthy families were taught reading, writing, rhetoric, and philosophy. These skills were essential for participation in public life, for governance, law, and administration. But if you look at the broader system, education seems to have played a more subtle role than is often emphasized. Because even if formal schooling was limited, the empire still required a large number of individuals who could perform administrative tasks, record-keeping, communication, logistics. Not necessarily scholars, but people with practical knowledge and skills. This suggests that there were layers of learning beyond the formal education of the elite, perhaps less documented, but still essential. Apprenticeships, informal training, knowledge passed within families or professional groups. These are all likely mechanisms, and yet they're not always highlighted in the main narrative. They exist in the background, implied, but not fully detailed. And this pattern, visible structures supported by less visible systems, continues to appear, even in something as physical as Roman construction. When we look at surviving structures, roads, aqueducts, buildings, we often focus on the final result: the durability, the scale, the precision. But behind each structure is a process, a series of steps that had to be repeated consistently across different locations and time periods. Materials had to be sourced, workers had to be organized, techniques had to be applied correctly, and all of this had to happen without modern machinery or standardized industrial systems. The mainstream explanation is that Roman engineers and builders developed effective methods and passed them down through experience. And again, that's entirely reasonable. But when you consider the repetition of similar techniques across vast distances, it suggests a level of shared understanding that goes beyond isolated expertise. It suggests networks of knowledge, not necessarily centralized in a single place. but distributed, connected through movement of people, ideas, and practices. Soldiers who became builders, engineers who traveled between regions, administrators who oversaw projects in multiple locations, all contributing to a kind of informal but persistent exchange of information. And this is where the picture of the Roman Empire begins to feel less like a static structure and more like a living system. A system made up of countless interactions, some documented, many not, all contributing to an overall pattern that appears stable from a distance, but is actually supported by constant movement and adaptation. And when you think about it this way, the empire becomes less about individual achievements and more about processes. Processes that worked well enough, consistently enough, to maintain a complex network over time. Which brings us to another interesting angle. Not a contradiction, but a contrast. Because while Rome is often remembered for its order and structure, its history is also filled with periods of instability, political struggles, economic challenges, external threats, emperors rising and falling, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not. And yet, despite these disruptions, many of the core systems continued to function. The military kept operating, infrastructure was maintained, laws were applied, not perfectly, but persistently. This resilience is usually explained as the strength of Roman institutions, and that's a valid explanation. But it also raises a quiet question. What gives a system that kind of resilience? Is it the design itself, the way it's structured? Or is it something less tangible, a shared set of assumptions, habits, and expectations that guide behavior even when leadership changes? Because systems don't sustain themselves automatically. They rely on people, on decisions made daily, often without direct oversight. And when those decisions align consistently with the needs of the system, stability emerges. Not perfect stability, but enough to maintain continuity. And so, as we move through this exploration, it becomes less about identifying a single secret, and more about recognizing patterns that repeat across different aspects of the empire. Patterns of structure and flexibility, visibility and hidden support, stability and adaptation. Nothing here contradicts mainstream history. In fact, it builds on it. But by looking a little more closely, by allowing space for questions that don't demand immediate answers, the familiar picture of the Roman Empire begins to shift slightly. Not dramatically, just enough to notice that there may be more layers to it than we usually consider. And we'll continue to move through those layers, one at a time, letting each detail settle before moving to the next. As we continue moving through the structure of the Roman Empire, it becomes useful to shift our attention slightly, away from the legions and visible systems of control, and towards something quieter, but just as influential, the flow of information itself. Not in the modern sense of instant communication, but in the slower, more deliberate way information moved across the ancient world, carried by people, shaped by distance, and filtered through layers of interpretation. Because if there is one thing that large, long-lasting systems depend on, it's not just power or infrastructure, but the ability to move knowledge from one place to another, consistently enough to maintain coherence. In the mainstream view, Rome's communication system was practical and structured. Roads connected distant regions, couriers carried messages, ships transported goods and information across the Mediterranean. The cursus publicus, the state-run courier and transportation network, is often highlighted as a key component, allowing officials to send and receive messages with a level of efficiency that was advanced for its time. Relay stations, fresh horses, designated routes, all designed to keep information moving, and that explanation holds up. It aligns with what we know from historical records, but when you pause and think about what that system was actually doing, it becomes more interesting in subtle ways. Because communication is not just about speed, it's about reliability and interpretation. A message sent from Rome to a distant province could take days or weeks to arrive. By the time it reached its destination, conditions might have changed. Decisions would often need to be made before new instructions arrived, which means that local officials had to operate with a degree of autonomy, interpreting guidance rather than simply following it. And this introduces a quiet complexity, because for the system to function, those interpretations had to align, at least broadly, with the intentions of the central authority. Not perfectly, but consistently enough to maintain order. And that consistency suggests something deeper than just written instructions. It suggests shared assumptions, a kind of unspoken understanding of how things are supposed to work. Not just rules on a page, but patterns of thinking that guide decision-making in the absence of direct oversight. This is something that doesn't always leave clear traces in the historical record, but it's often visible in the outcomes. Because when multiple individuals, separated by distance and circumstance, make decisions that align with a broader system, it implies that they are operating within a common framework, a framework that has been learned, internalized, and reinforced over time. In Rome's case, that framework likely included legal principles, administrative practices, cultural values, all woven together into a kind of operational mindset. And while each of these elements is studied individually, the way they interact as a system is not always fully explored. And this brings us to writing itself. Latin, as the administrative language of the empire, played a central role in communication. Official documents, legal texts, military orders, all relied on written language to convey meaning across distances. But writing, especially in the ancient world, is not just a tool, it's a filter. Because not everyone could read, not everyone could write, which means that written information often passed through intermediaries, scribes, officials, translators. And at each stage, there is the potential for subtle shifts in meaning. Not necessarily errors, just variations in interpretation. And yet, despite this, the system functioned, which suggests that the core ideas being communicated were robust enough to withstand minor variations. That the structure of Roman administration did not depend on perfect transmission, but on general alignment. And this is where things begin to feel quietly sophisticated. Because in many modern systems, precision is everything. Exact wording, exact data, exact timing. But in the Roman world, where such precision was difficult to maintain, the system seems to have relied more on consistency of intent than exact replication of instructions. In other words, it was designed, or perhaps evolved, to work even when information was imperfect. And that idea becomes even more interesting when you consider the role of culture. Roman culture was not just something that existed within the city of Rome. It spread outward, influencing the regions it connected with. Language, customs, architecture, even daily habits, all contributing to a shared identity that extended beyond geography. The mainstream explanation is that this cultural spread was a byproduct of conquest and integration. Soldiers settling in new regions, merchants traveling, local populations adopting Roman practices, all gradually blending together. But culture also acts as a form of communication. It transmits expectations, norms, ways of thinking, often without the need for explicit instruction. And when a shared culture exists, it reduces the need for constant oversight, because individuals already have a sense of what is expected. In that sense, culture becomes a stabilizing force, not imposed entirely from the top down, but reinforced through daily life. through interactions, traditions, and shared experiences. And over time, this creates a kind of continuity that supports the more visible structures of governance and law, which leads to a subtle but important observation. The Roman Empire may not have been held together solely by its institutions, but by the alignment between those institutions and the people operating within them. And that alignment is not something that can be fully explained by written records alone. It emerges from a combination of factors: education, experience, social norms, incentives, all interacting in ways that are difficult to measure, but visible in the overall stability of the system. And then, of course, there's the question of information loss, because while we have a significant amount of historical material from the Roman period, it is only a fraction of what once existed. Documents have been lost, damaged, or never recorded in the first place, which means that our understanding of how information flowed within the empire is necessarily incomplete. We see the outcomes, the laws, the structures, the surviving texts, but the day-to-day processes that supported them are often only partially visible. And this opens the door to careful speculation, not in the sense of imagining hidden technologies or unknown forces, but in recognizing that complex systems often rely on practices that are so routine, so embedded in daily life, that they are rarely documented in detail. Things like informal communication networks, personal relationships between officials, unwritten conventions that guide behavior. These are all elements that can play a significant role in how a system functions, but leave limited direct evidence. And so, when we look at the Roman Empire through this lens, it becomes less about isolated achievements and more about interconnected processes. Communication, not just as the movement of messages, but as the transmission of understanding. Writing not just as a record, but as a tool shaped by those who use it. Culture not just as identity, but as a mechanism for alignment. And within all of this, a system that appears stable from a distance, but is actually supported by countless small interactions, happening continuously, often unnoticed. Which brings us to another quiet layer, one that sits somewhere between the physical and the abstract. Because information doesn't just move through systems, it also accumulates. Knowledge builds over time. Practices are refined. Mistakes are corrected, sometimes slowly, sometimes not at all. And in a long-lasting system like Rome, this accumulation creates depth, layers of experience that influence future decisions. But accumulation also introduces complexity, because not all knowledge is equally preserved. Some ideas are recorded and passed down. Others fade, replaced by new approaches. And occasionally, something is lost entirely. Not because it was hidden, but because it was no longer seen as necessary, which raises an interesting possibility that some aspects of Roman systems, not the major structures, but the smaller, supporting practices, may have existed in forms that we no longer fully recognize. Not lost in a mysterious sense, just faded over time, leaving behind only indirect traces. And so, as we continue this exploration, the focus remains the same. Not to replace established history, but to look at it from slightly different angles, to notice where explanations feel complete and where they invite further thought. To recognize that even well-documented systems can contain layers that are not immediately visible, and to move through those layers slowly, allowing each detail to connect with the next. As we move a little deeper into the structure of the Roman Empire, it becomes useful to turn our attention towards something that is often described in very practical terms, and yet, when observed more closely, begins to reveal a quieter layer of complexity: the Roman economy. Not just coins and trade routes, but the underlying system that allowed resources to move, accumulate, and sustain an empire of that scale over long periods of time. Because while military strength and governance are often emphasized, they depend on something more foundational, a steady flow of materials, labor, and value. In the mainstream understanding, the Roman economy was based on agriculture, taxation, and trade. Vast estates produced grain, olives, wine, supplying both local populations and distant cities. Taxes were collected in various forms, sometimes in currency, sometimes in goods. Trade networks connected regions across the Mediterranean, allowing resources to move where they were needed. Ports were active, roads facilitated transport, and markets operated at multiple levels of society. This explanation is consistent with what we know. Archaeological evidence supports it, written records describe it, and it fits within the broader patterns of ancient economies. But when you begin to think about the scale, and more importantly, the continuity, it invites a closer look. Because an economy is not just about production and exchange, it's about balance, supply and demand, stability and fluctuation, local needs and central requirements. And in a system as large as Rome's, maintaining that balance becomes increasingly complex. Harvests could vary, trade routes could be disrupted, political instability could affect production. And yet, for long stretches of time, the system functioned well enough to sustain large urban populations, including the city of Rome itself, which relied heavily on imported grain. The mainstream explanation often points to administrative oversight and logistical planning. Grain shipments from provinces like Egypt and North Africa were organized to supply Rome. Storage facilities, distribution systems, and state involvement helped ensure that shortages were minimized. And again, this makes sense. But even within that explanation, there are layers worth noticing. Because organizing a grain supply across the Mediterranean is not a simple task. It requires coordination between producers, transporters, and administrators. It depends on seasonal timing, weather conditions, and the reliability of routes. And it must be repeated year after year with enough consistency to prevent disruption, which suggests that the Roman system was not just reactive, but anticipatory, planning ahead, accounting for variation, building in a degree of redundancy. Not perfectly, of course. Shortages did occur, but often managed in ways that prevented complete collapse. And this ability to absorb disruption without immediate breakdown is a subtle but important feature of resilient systems. It also raises a quiet question about information once again. Because to plan effectively, you need some awareness of conditions across different regions, not in real time, but at least in patterns. Knowledge of harvest cycles, typical yields, common risks. And while some of this information could be recorded, much of it likely existed as experience, accumulated over time by those involved in the system. Farmers, traders, officials, each contributing pieces of knowledge that, when combined, created a broader understanding of how the system functioned. And this brings us to coinage. Roman coins are often seen as a symbol of economic organization. Standardized currency, widely circulated, facilitating trade across different regions. The mainstream explanation is straightforward. Coins made transactions easier, allowed for taxation, and supported economic integration. But coins also carry information, not just monetary value, but imagery, inscriptions, symbols of authority. Emperors' faces, messages of stability, references to victories or achievements. In this sense, coinage becomes a form of communication, reinforcing the presence of central authority across the empire. And here, the economic system overlaps with the informational system, because every transaction involving a coin is also a small moment of reinforcement. a reminder of the broader structure within which that transaction takes place. Not in a conscious way necessarily, but as part of the background of daily life. And when this happens repeatedly, across millions of interactions, it contributes to a kind of cohesion, a shared sense of participation in a larger system, which leads to another layer, taxation. In the mainstream view, Roman taxation was necessary to support the military, infrastructure, and administration. Taxes were collected from provinces, sometimes directly, sometimes through local intermediaries. The system could be complex and at times burdensome, but it provided the resources needed to sustain the empire. And again, this explanation is well supported. But taxation is not just about collection. It's about predictability. For a system to function, those being taxed need some sense of what is expected. Not necessarily fairness in the modern sense, but consistency. If expectations change too frequently or unpredictably, it can disrupt economic activity. People adjust their behavior based on what they anticipate. And so, a relatively stable taxation system contributes not just to revenue, but to the overall functioning of the economy, which suggests that Roman administrators had to balance extraction with sustainability, collect enough to support the system, but not so much that it undermines the ability to produce in the future. This balance is not always visible in historical summaries, but it is implied in the longevity of the system. And then there's trade. The Mediterranean, often described as the center of Roman trade, functioned almost like a connecting space rather than a barrier. Goods moved by ship between regions, sometimes over long distances. Grain, metals, textiles, spices, each following routes shaped by geography, demand, and opportunity. The mainstream explanation emphasizes the role of infrastructure and relative security in facilitating this trade. Roman control of key regions reduced piracy, improved safety, and allowed merchants to operate with a degree of confidence. But trade networks are not just physical routes. They are relationships. Trust between merchants, shared expectations about value, informal agreements that develop over time. And these relationships are not always recorded in detail, but they are essential for sustained exchange, which means that behind the visible movement of goods, there is a less visible network of human connections. Individuals interacting repeatedly, building familiarity, adjusting to each other's needs. And this network, like others we've observed, contributes to stability in ways that are difficult to quantify, but easy to overlook. Because when systems are described at a high level, production, taxation, trade, the smaller interactions tend to fade into the background. And yet, they are what make the larger system possible. And this brings us back to a recurring pattern: visible structures supported by less visible processes. The economy of the Roman Empire was not just a collection of resources and transactions. It was a dynamic system shaped by countless decisions, influenced by both formal rules and informal practices. And when viewed in this way, it becomes clear that its stability was not guaranteed, but maintained. Maintained through adaptation, through accumulated knowledge, through alignment between different parts of the system, not perfectly, not without disruption, but with enough consistency to sustain the empire over time. And as we continue, we'll begin to look at how this economic system interacted with other aspects of Roman life, how wealth influenced power, how resources shaped decisions, and how underlying pressures may have developed, sometimes slowly, almost imperceptibly, beneath the surface of apparent stability. As we continue to move through the deeper layers of the Roman Empire, it becomes necessary to shift our focus towards something that is often described in broad, familiar terms, and yet, when examined more closely, begins to reveal a quieter set of questions beneath the surface. the structure of power itself. Not just who ruled, but how authority was maintained, transferred, and perceived across generations. Because while Rome is often remembered for its emperors, its politics, and its moments of transition, the underlying continuity of power is something that invites a more careful look. In the mainstream view, Roman power evolved over time. Beginning with the Republic, authority was distributed among elected officials, the Senate, and various assemblies. This system, while complex, was designed to prevent concentration of power in a single individual. Checks and balances existed, at least in theory, and political life was shaped by competition among elite families. Over time, however, internal conflicts, social pressures, and external challenges placed increasing strain on this system, eventually leading to the rise of individuals who held more centralized authority. This transition is most often associated with figures like Julius Caesar, whose accumulation of power marked a turning point in Roman history. The mainstream explanation is that Caesar's actions exposed the limitations of the republican system, that the structures in place were no longer sufficient to manage the scale and complexity of the empire. After his assassination, a period of instability followed, ultimately leading to the rise of Augustus, who established what we now recognize as the Roman Empire. And on the surface, this narrative feels clear. A republic under pressure gives way to centralized rule, a transition driven by necessity, shaped by political realities. But when you slow down and examine the details, there are aspects of this shift that feel more gradual than they are sometimes presented. Because the Republic did not simply disappear overnight, many of its institutions remained in place. The Senate continued to exist. Traditional offices were preserved, at least in form. Augustus himself was careful to present his authority not as a break from the past, but as a continuation of it. Titles were chosen carefully. Language was controlled. The appearance of shared governance was maintained, even as actual power became more concentrated. And this introduces a subtle but important dynamic, a system that changes its function while preserving its form. From a mainstream perspective, this is often described as political strategy. Augustus understood the importance of legitimacy, of maintaining stability during a period of transition. By preserving familiar structures, he reduced resistance and allowed the system to adapt without appearing to fundamentally change. But this also raises a deeper question. How aware were the people within the system of the nature of this change? Because for a shift like this to succeed, it doesn't require complete secrecy, but it does rely on a certain level of acceptance. Not necessarily agreement, but a willingness to operate within the new reality. And that acceptance can come from many sources. Stability after conflict, economic security, cultural reinforcement, all contributing to a gradual normalization of the new structure, which suggests that power in Rome was not maintained solely through force or formal authority, but through perception, not in a manipulative sense, but in the way systems present themselves to those who live within them. The alignment between what people believe about a system and how that system actually functions plays a significant role in its stability. And this pattern does not end with Augustus. As the empire continued, emperors varied widely in their approach to power. Some ruled with relative restraint, others with more visible authority. Some were seen as effective, others less so. And yet, despite these differences, the structure itself remained. This continuity is often explained as institutional strength. The idea that Roman systems were robust enough to withstand changes in leadership. And again, this explanation is valid, but it also invites a quieter observation that the structure of power may have become, over time, somewhat independent of the individuals within it. In other words, the system continued, even when the people at the top changed. And this brings us to succession. One of the more commonly discussed challenges in Roman history is the lack of a clear, consistent method for transferring power. Unlike hereditary monarchies with established rules of succession, the Roman Empire often relied on a combination of adoption, political support, and military backing. Emperors could designate heirs, but these designations were not always followed. Power could shift unexpectedly, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not. From a mainstream perspective, this is seen as a source of instability. Periods of contested succession often led to conflict, uncertainty, and at times, fragmentation. And yet, even with these disruptions, the empire continued. Which raises an interesting point, that the system was able to absorb irregularities in leadership without immediate collapse. Not indefinitely, but for significant periods of time. And this resilience suggests that power in Rome was distributed in ways that are not always immediately visible. While the emperor held ultimate authority, other structures, administrative, military, economic, continued to function even when leadership was uncertain, which leads to another layer. Because power is not just about who makes decisions, but about how those decisions are implemented. An emperor could issue orders, but those orders had to be carried out by a network of officials, soldiers, and administrators. And for that to happen consistently, there had to be a degree of alignment between different levels of the system. This alignment is not always formalized. It emerges from shared expectations, incentives, and experiences. From individuals understanding their roles within a larger structure and acting in ways that support its continuation. And over time, this creates a kind of momentum, a system that continues to operate not just because of top-down control, but because of the accumulated patterns of behavior within it. And this brings us back to perception. Because while the formal structure of power in Rome shifted from republic to empire, the way that power was experienced by many individuals may have changed more gradually. Local governance, daily life, economic activity. These continued, often with a degree of continuity that softened the impact of larger political changes, which suggests that the transformation of Rome was not just a political event, but a process that unfolded over time, shaped by both deliberate actions and gradual adjustments. Not a single moment of change, but a series of shifts that, taken together, created a new structure. And within that process, there are always details that are more difficult to see. Small decisions, informal agreements, personal relationships, all contributing to how power actually functioned on a day-to-day level. These elements rarely appear in broad historical narratives, but they are essential for understanding how systems operate in practice. Because large structures are built from small interactions. And when those interactions align consistently, they create patterns that can persist over long periods of time. So as we continue this exploration, the focus remains steady. Not to challenge what is known, but to look at it from different angles. To recognize that even well-documented transitions contain layers that are not immediately visible, and to allow those layers to emerge gradually through observation, reflection, and careful consideration. And from here, we begin to move toward another dimension of Roman life, one that is often described in physical terms, but carries deeper implications for how the empire functioned as a whole. The spaces people lived in, the environments they moved through, and the structures that quietly shaped their daily experience. As we continue moving through the deeper layers of the Roman Empire, it becomes useful to slow down again and shift our attention towards something that is always present, but rarely examined as a system in itself: the physical spaces of Roman life. Not just buildings or monuments, but the environments people move through every day. the streets, the homes, the public areas. The way space was organized, experienced, and perhaps most importantly, structured to guide behavior without needing constant instruction. In the mainstream understanding, Roman cities were designed with a degree of order that reflected practical needs. Many followed grid-like layouts, especially in newly founded settlements. There were roads that intersected at right angles, central forums for political and social activity, baths for hygiene and relaxation, markets for trade, and temples for religious life. This kind of organization is often presented as a reflection of Roman efficiency, a way to create functional, manageable urban environments. And that explanation works. It aligns with archaeological findings and historical descriptions. But when you begin to consider how these spaces were actually used, and how consistently similar patterns appear across different regions, it starts to feel like something more than just practical design. Because space influences behavior, often in subtle ways. When streets are laid out in a certain pattern, they guide movement. When public buildings are placed at central points, they draw attention and activity. When certain structures are repeated across different cities, they create familiarity, even for people traveling from one region to another. And this familiarity can reduce uncertainty, making it easier to navigate new environments without needing explicit guidance. Which suggests that Roman urban planning may have done more than organize space. It may have helped organize experience. Not intentionally in every detail, perhaps, but as a natural outcome of repeated design principles. Over time, as cities were built and rebuilt, certain patterns became standard. And once those patterns were established, they could be applied consistently, creating a kind of shared spatial language across the empire. And this idea becomes even more interesting when you consider the role of the Forum. The Forum was not just a marketplace or a political center, it was a focal point, a place where different aspects of Roman life intersected. Legal matters, commerce, social interaction, public announcements, all occurring within a defined space. In the mainstream view, this is simply how cities functioned, central areas for gathering and activity. But when you think about it more carefully, the Forum also acted as a point of convergence for information, not in a formal sense like a communication network, but as a physical location where people exchanged news, observed public proceedings, and experienced the presence of authority. Statues, inscriptions, official buildings, all contributing to an environment that reinforced certain ideas about order, governance, and identity. And because similar forums existed across different cities, this experience was not limited to one place. It became part of a broader pattern, which brings us to housing. Roman homes varied widely depending on social status. Wealthier individuals lived in domus, often with interior courtyards, carefully designed spaces, and decorative elements. In contrast, many urban residents lived in insulae, multi-story apartment buildings that housed large numbers of people in relatively compact areas. The mainstream explanation focuses on these differences as a reflection of social hierarchy, which is accurate. But housing also shapes daily routines. The way space is divided, the proximity to neighbors, access to light and air, all influence how people live, interact, and perceive their environment. In densely populated insulae, life would have been more communal, more immediate. In larger homes, more private, more controlled. And yet, despite these differences, there were shared elements: access to public baths, movement through common streets, participation in markets and forums. These experiences created points of overlap between different layers of society. Not complete equality, of course, but moments where the same spaces were used by many. And this overlap contributes to a kind of cohesion, not by removing differences, but by creating shared reference points. Which leads us to the baths, something often described in straightforward terms: hygiene, relaxation, social activity. Roman baths were widespread, accessible, and played a significant role in daily life. The mainstream explanation emphasizes their importance as a public amenity, a place for cleaning, conversation, and leisure. But baths also represent something more subtle. They are structured environments, with sequences of rooms, varying temperatures, specific pathways through the space. Visitors moved from one area to another, cold, warm, hot, following a pattern that was both physical and experiential. And when this pattern is repeated regularly, it becomes familiar, a kind of routine that shapes how time is spent, how the body is experienced, how social interaction occurs. Not imposed strictly, but encouraged through design. And once again, this pattern appears across different cities, which suggests that Roman spaces were not just built for function, but for consistency of experience. And this idea extends even further when we consider monuments and architecture more broadly. Structures like amphitheaters, temples, and administrative buildings were often designed with similar visual elements: columns, arches, proportions that followed recognizable styles. These elements are usually discussed in terms of aesthetics or engineering, and that's valid. But they also create a visual continuity, a sense that, regardless of where you are within the empire, certain forms remain the same. And this consistency can reinforce the idea of belonging to a larger system, even without explicit messaging, because recognition itself carries meaning. Seeing familiar structures in unfamiliar places can create a sense of connection, a subtle reassurance that the environment follows known patterns. And this brings us back to a recurring theme, that systems are not held together by a single factor, but by the interaction of many elements. In the case of Rome, physical spaces, like laws, military structures, and economic systems, contributed to a broader alignment. Not perfectly, not without variation, but with enough consistency to support the overall structure. And within that alignment, there is room for quiet speculation. Not about hidden intentions or unknown forces, but about how design, repetition, and experience interact over time. How patterns become embedded, how they influence behavior without needing constant reinforcement. Because when something is encountered daily, when it becomes part of routine, it no longer needs to be explained. It simply is. And so, as we continue this exploration, we begin to see the Roman Empire not just as a collection of institutions or achievements, but as an environment, a constructed world shaped by both visible decisions and less visible patterns, experienced by millions of people in ways that are only partially captured in the historical record. And from here, we begin to move toward another layer, one that exists alongside these physical spaces, influencing them and being influenced in return. The belief systems, rituals, and symbolic structures that helped give meaning to Roman life, and perhaps played a role in maintaining the coherence of the empire over time. As we continue moving through the layered structure of the Roman Empire, it becomes necessary to look at something less tangible than roads or armies, but just as influential: the system of belief. Not only religion in the formal sense, but the broader framework of rituals, symbols, and shared assumptions that shaped how people understood their place within the empire. Because while physical systems organize movement and action, belief systems tend to organize meaning. And meaning, in many ways, determines how willingly people participate in a structure larger than themselves. In the mainstream understanding, Roman religion was polytheistic, flexible, and deeply integrated into daily life. Gods and goddesses were associated with natural forces, human activities, and abstract concepts. Rituals were performed to maintain favor, ensure stability, and mark important transitions. Temples were built, sacrifices were made, festivals were observed. And unlike some later religious systems, Roman belief was not always centered on personal faith in the modern sense, but on correct practice, on maintaining the proper relationship between humans and the divine. This explanation is well supported by historical evidence. Inscriptions, texts, and archaeological remains all point to a society where ritual played a consistent role. But when you begin to look more closely, there are aspects of this system that feel quietly structural, almost like another layer of organization beneath the visible institutions. Because Roman religion was not isolated from governance, it was intertwined with it. Public officials often held religious roles. Decisions could be influenced by omens, interpretations of signs, or established rituals. Ceremonies accompanied political events, military campaigns, and civic activities. In this sense, religion was not a separate domain. It was embedded within the functioning of the state. And this integration raises an interesting point, because when belief and governance are closely aligned, they can reinforce each other. Rituals can legitimize authority. Authority can maintain rituals. And over time, this creates a feedback loop, a system in which actions are not only performed, but justified within a shared framework of meaning. From a mainstream perspective, this is often described as tradition, the continuation of practices that have been accepted over time, and that is certainly part of it. But it also suggests that belief systems may have played a role in stabilizing the broader structure of the empire, not by enforcing rules directly, but by shaping how those rules were perceived. And this becomes even more noticeable when we consider the role of the emperor. As the empire developed, emperors were not only political leaders, but increasingly associated with divine status. The imperial cult, as it is commonly known, involved the veneration of the emperor, particularly after death, and in some cases during their lifetime. Temples were dedicated, rituals performed, and loyalty expressed in ways that blended political allegiance with religious practice. The mainstream explanation is that this served to unify the empire, providing a focal point for loyalty across diverse regions. And again, this explanation fits the available evidence, but it also introduces a subtle shift, because when political authority is connected to something perceived as divine, it changes how that authority is experienced. Not necessarily making it unquestionable, history shows that emperors could still face opposition, but adding a layer of symbolic significance that goes beyond simple governance. And this symbolic layer can be powerful, not because it forces belief, but because it frames participation. Taking part in rituals, acknowledging the emperor's status, engaging in shared practices. These actions contribute to a sense of belonging within the system. Not always consciously, often simply as part of routine. And this brings us to another aspect of Roman belief, its adaptability. Unlike more rigid systems, Roman religion was capable of incorporating elements from other cultures. As the empire expanded, it encountered a wide range of local beliefs and practices. Rather than replacing them entirely, Roman systems often absorbed them, identifying similarities, integrating deities, allowing local traditions to continue alongside Roman ones. From a mainstream perspective, this is seen as a pragmatic approach, reducing resistance and facilitating integration. And that interpretation is well supported. But it also suggests something about the nature of the belief system itself, that it was not defined by strict boundaries, but by a kind of flexible framework, capable of expanding without losing its core identity. And this flexibility may have contributed to the overall stability of the empire by allowing different regions to maintain a sense of continuity while still participating in a larger structure. And then there is ritual. Rituals, in the Roman context, were often precise. Actions performed in specific ways, at specific times, for specific purposes. The emphasis was not always on personal interpretation, but on correctness, on doing things as they were meant to be done. And when rituals are repeated over time, they create patterns. Patterns that shape how people experience events, transitions, and relationships. Not necessarily through conscious reflection, but through familiarity. Through the sense that certain actions are appropriate in certain contexts, that there is a way things are done. And this repetition contributes to stability. Because when people share rituals, they share expectations. And shared expectations reduce uncertainty, making it easier for individuals to navigate complex social environments, which leads to a quieter observation that belief systems, like physical spaces, can guide behavior without needing constant explanation. They create a kind of background structure, one that supports the more visible systems of governance and economy, not replacing them, but reinforcing them in subtle ways. And of course, not all beliefs were uniform. Different regions, different communities, even different individuals would have experienced Roman religion in varied ways. Some may have been more devout, others more practical. Some may have focused on local traditions, others on imperial rituals. And this variation is important because it reminds us that the system was not monolithic. It allowed for differences, for adaptations, for personal and regional variation, while still maintaining an overall coherence. And that coherence, like in other aspects of the empire, seems to emerge from alignment rather than uniformity, from shared patterns rather than identical beliefs. And then, as we move toward the later periods of the empire, we begin to see shifts, new belief systems emerging, interacting with existing ones, sometimes integrating, sometimes conflicting, changes that reflect broader transformations within the empire itself. But even in these moments of transition, the role of belief as a structuring force remains, not static, not unchanging, but continuously influencing how people understand their place within the system. And so, as we continue this exploration, the focus remains steady, to observe how different layers, physical, administrative, economic, and now symbolic, interact to create something that appears stable from a distance, but is supported by constant movement beneath the surface. And from here, we begin to move toward another dimension, one that connects all of these layers in a more immediate way: the daily lives of individuals, the rhythms of routine, and the subtle patterns that emerge when systems are experienced not as structures, but as lived reality. As we continue moving through the structure of the Roman Empire, it becomes useful to shift perspective once again, away from the large systems and into something more immediate: the experience of daily life. Not in a dramatic sense, but in the quiet repetition of routines, the patterns that individuals moved through without necessarily thinking about them. Because while empires are often described through their leaders, their wars, and their infrastructure, they are actually sustained by something much smaller: the consistency of everyday behavior across millions of people. In the mainstream understanding, daily life in the Roman world varied depending on location and social status. A farmer in a rural province would experience something very different from a merchant in a busy port city, or a senator in Rome. This diversity is well documented, and it reflects the scale of the empire itself. But within that diversity, there are recurring rhythms, patterns that appear across different regions, shaping how people interacted with the systems around them. Most individuals would have lived within a fairly predictable cycle: work, rest, social interaction, participation in local customs or rituals, all repeated in ways that created a sense of continuity. Markets opened and closed, baths were visited regularly, public spaces filled and emptied according to time of day. These rhythms are often mentioned in historical descriptions, but they are not always examined as part of the larger system, because repetition creates stability. When actions are performed regularly, they become expected. When expectations are shared, coordination becomes easier. People don't need constant instructions if they already know what typically happens next. And in a system as large as Rome's, this kind of implicit coordination would have been essential, which leads to a quiet observation. That much of the empire's stability may have come not from top-down control, but from bottom-up consistency. Individuals following routines, interacting in predictable ways, making small decisions that align with broader patterns, all contributing to a system that appears stable from a distance, but is actually supported by countless local actions. And this becomes more interesting when we consider time. Not time as we measure it today, with precise clocks and schedules, but time as it was experienced in the Roman world, largely structured by natural cycles, daylight, seasons, agricultural rhythms. Activities would have been organized around these patterns, creating a shared sense of timing that did not require centralized coordination. From a mainstream perspective, this is simply how pre-modern societies functioned. And that's true. But it also suggests that the empire operated within a temporal framework that was inherently distributed. No single authority needed to tell people when to begin or end their day. The structure was already embedded in the environment, and this embedded structure reduces the need for constant oversight. Because when people share the same rhythms, their actions naturally align more often than they conflict. And then there's movement. People in the Roman world were not static. Soldiers were stationed in different regions, merchants traveled between cities, officials were assigned to provinces, and even ordinary individuals might move for work or opportunity. This movement created connections between different parts of the empire, not just through formal systems, but through personal experience. A soldier who served in one region and later settled in another would carry knowledge, habits, and expectations with them. A merchant traveling along established routes would become familiar with multiple local systems, adjusting and connecting them through trade. Over time, these movements contribute to a kind of informal integration, a blending of practices that supports the overall coherence of the empire. And this is something that doesn't always appear clearly in written records, because it happens gradually, through individual actions rather than formal policies. And yet, its effects are visible in the consistency of certain patterns across different regions. Which brings us to social interaction. Roman society, like any other, was built on relationships, family, friendship, professional connections, all influencing how individuals navigated their environment. In the mainstream view, these relationships are often discussed in terms of social hierarchy and patronage systems. Wealthy individuals providing support to those of a lower status, in exchange for loyalty or service. This system, known as patron-client relationships, is well documented. It helped structure social interactions, distribute resources, and maintain a degree of order within communities. But beyond its formal aspects, it also created networks. Connections that extended beyond immediate circles, linking individuals into broader systems of support and influence. And these networks, while not always visible at a large scale, contribute to the functioning of the empire in subtle ways. Because when people are connected through relationships, information flows more easily, assistance can be coordinated, problems can be addressed locally before they escalate. And this again reduces the need for centralized intervention, not eliminating it, but complementing it. And then there's the question of awareness. How much did the average person understand about the empire as a whole? From a mainstream perspective, it's likely that most individuals were primarily focused on their immediate surroundings, their city, their region, their daily concerns. The larger structure of the empire may have been more abstract, something acknowledged but not constantly considered. And yet, certain elements would have made that larger structure visible. Coins bearing the image of the emperor, public announcements, military presence, shared cultural practices. All of these serve as reminders, not always explicit, but present, which suggests that awareness of the empire existed at multiple levels, not as a detailed understanding, but as a general sense of belonging to something larger. And this sense of belonging, even if loosely defined, contributes to stability, because people are more likely to operate within a system if they recognize it, even if they don't fully understand its complexity. And so, when we look at daily life in the Roman Empire, it becomes clear that the system was not just maintained through large-scale structures, but through the accumulation of small, repeated actions, routines that align, movements that connect, relationships that support, awareness that reinforces. None of these elements alone explain the longevity of the empire, but together they form a kind of foundation, one that is less visible than roads or armies, but just as important. And this brings us back to a familiar pattern. That stability often emerges not from a single source, but from the interaction of many layers, each supporting the others in ways that are not always immediately obvious. And as we continue, we begin to move toward another aspect of the Roman system, one that sits at the intersection of daily life and larger structures, the management of resources over time, and the subtle pressures that can build within even the most stable systems, sometimes slowly enough that they are only visible when viewed in retrospect. As we continue moving through the deeper structure of the Roman Empire, it becomes necessary to turn our attention towards something that often sits just beneath the surface of stability, the gradual accumulation of pressure. Not the kind that appears suddenly or dramatically, but the slower, almost unnoticeable shifts that build over time within complex systems. Because while Rome is often remembered for its strength, its organization, and its long periods of continuity, it is equally shaped by the quieter processes that began to test that stability, sometimes long before any visible signs of decline appeared. In the mainstream understanding, the challenges faced by the empire are usually grouped into familiar categories: economic strain, political instability, military pressure from external groups, and administrative complexity. These explanations are supported by historical evidence, and they provide a coherent framework for understanding how such a vast system eventually began to fragment, particularly in the Western regions. But when you slow down and look at these factors not as isolated causes, but as interacting processes, something more subtle begins to emerge. Because pressure rarely builds in a straight line, it accumulates unevenly, in different places, at different speeds, often in ways that are not immediately visible from the center. And in a system as large as Rome's, this uneven accumulation can create a kind of imbalance, where certain regions or structures begin to experience strain before others. Take the economy, for example. As we explored earlier, the Roman economic system relied on a balance between production, taxation, and trade. But over time, maintaining that balance becomes more difficult. Agricultural output can fluctuate. Trade routes can be disrupted. The cost of maintaining infrastructure and military presence can increase. The mainstream explanation often points to inflation, debasement of currency, and increased taxation as signs of economic stress, and these are well documented. But they are also symptoms, indicators that something within the system is adjusting, sometimes in ways that create new pressures elsewhere. For instance, when currency is debased, when the metal content of coins is reduced, it may provide short-term relief by increasing the money supply. But it can also reduce trust in the currency over time, affecting trade and pricing. This in turn can lead to further adjustments, creating a cycle that becomes increasingly difficult to stabilize. And this pattern of solutions creating new challenges is common in complex systems, because each adjustment interacts with existing structures, sometimes reinforcing stability, sometimes introducing new forms of strain. And this brings us to the military. The Roman army, as we've seen, was a central component of the empire's strength, but it was also a significant resource demand. Soldiers needed to be recruited, trained, supplied, and paid. Fortifications had to be maintained. Campaigns required planning and logistics. As the empire expanded, the boundaries it needed to defend became longer and more complex. From a mainstream perspective, this is often described as overextension, the idea that the empire grew beyond its ability to effectively manage and defend its territories. And this explanation is compelling, but it also suggests a gradual shift, not an immediate problem, but a slow increase in the effort required to maintain the same level of control. Because defending a larger territory doesn't just require more resources, it requires coordination across greater distances. Communication delays become more significant. Local conditions vary more widely. Decisions become more context-dependent. And over time, this can lead to a situation where maintaining stability requires increasing effort, even if nothing appears dramatically different on the surface. And then, there is governance. As the empire grew, its administrative structure had to adapt. More officials, more layers of management, more complexity in how decisions were made and implemented. The mainstream view often highlights reforms, attempts to reorganize the system, improve efficiency, and respond to emerging challenges. But each layer of administration also introduces potential friction. More steps in decision-making, more opportunities for misalignment between different parts of the system, more reliance on individuals interpreting and applying policies in ways that may vary slightly from place to place. And again, these are not necessarily failures. They are natural consequences of scale, but they contribute to a gradual increase in complexity. And with complexity comes the possibility of reduced clarity, which leads to another subtle factor: time. Because the longer a system exists, the more layers it accumulates. Policies built on top of older policies. Practices that evolve over time, sometimes without fully replacing what came before. Knowledge that is preserved in some areas, but lost or altered in others. This accumulation can create depth, but it can also create weight. A kind of inertia that makes change more difficult, even when it becomes necessary. And within this context, even small disruptions can have amplified effects. A failed harvest in one region might be manageable. A disruption in trade might be temporary. A political conflict might be contained. But when multiple pressures occur simultaneously, or in close succession, the system may begin to respond in ways that are less predictable. Not collapsing immediately, but adjusting, redistributing strain, sometimes in ways that shift the burden to other parts of the system. And this is where the idea of resilience becomes more complex, because resilience is not just about resisting change, it's about adapting to it. And adaptation requires flexibility, the ability to modify structures, adjust practices, and respond to new conditions. In the Roman case, there is evidence of such adaptation: reforms, reorganizations, shifts in military strategy. But there are also indications that some aspects of the system became less flexible over time. Not rigid in an absolute sense, but less able to respond quickly or effectively to certain types of change. And this brings us to a quiet but important question. At what point does stability begin to limit adaptability? Because the very structures that support long-term continuity, standardized practices, established hierarchies, consistent systems, can also make it more difficult to implement significant changes when they are needed. And this is not unique to Rome. It is a pattern that appears in many complex systems, where success creates conditions that are difficult to alter, even when circumstances change. And so, when we look at the later periods of the Roman Empire, particularly in the West, the narrative of decline is often presented in relatively clear terms. External pressures, internal challenges, eventual fragmentation. But beneath that narrative, there is a more gradual process, one of accumulation, interaction, and adjustment. Pressures building slowly, sometimes unevenly, sometimes in ways that are only visible in hindsight. And within that process, there are always details that are difficult to capture fully. Local variations, individual decisions, small shifts in practice that, over time, contribute to larger patterns. Which means that the story of Rome is not just about what happened, but about how systems behave under sustained complexity. And as we continue this exploration, we begin to move closer to those later stages, not to focus on collapse as a single event, but to observe how change unfolds within a system that has been stable for a long time, and how that change is experienced differently depending on where you are within it. As we continue moving forward through the long arc of the Roman Empire, it becomes useful to pause within a period that is often described as both stable and quietly transformative. A time when, on the surface, the system appears to still function, but underneath, certain shifts begin to change how that system operates. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but gradually enough that, for many living within it, the change might not feel like change at all. In the mainstream understanding, the later centuries of the Roman Empire are marked by reform as much as by pressure. Emperors attempted to reorganize administration, adjust the military structure, and stabilize the economy. One of the most well-known figures associated with this period is Diocletian, who introduced a series of changes designed to address the growing complexity of governing such a vast territory. The empire was effectively divided into smaller administrative units, authority was distributed among multiple rulers, and new systems were put in place to improve control and responsiveness. From a historical perspective, these reforms are often seen as necessary adaptations. The scale of the empire had reached a point where centralized control from a single location was no longer practical. Dividing responsibilities allowed for more localized decision-making, quicker responses to regional challenges, and a clearer chain of command in certain areas. And yet, even within this practical explanation, there is a quieter shift taking place. Because when a system reorganizes itself in response to complexity, it doesn't simply return to its previous state of balance. It becomes something slightly different. The structure changes, even if the identity appears the same. And this becomes especially noticeable when we consider the division between the eastern and western parts of the empire. In the mainstream narrative, this division is often presented as an administrative necessity, a way to manage a vast territory more effectively. Over time, however, the eastern portion, centered around Constantinople, became more stable and economically resilient, while the western regions faced increasing challenges. This difference is usually explained through a combination of factors: economic strength, geographic advantages, external pressures. And these explanations are well supported. But when viewed through the lens of systems, The division itself introduces an interesting dynamic, because splitting a system can reduce complexity in the short term, but it can also create divergence over time. Different regions begin to develop their own patterns, their own priorities, their own ways of responding to challenges. Communication between them continues, but it becomes less immediate, less unified, and gradually, what was once a single system begins to function more like two interconnected but distinct structures. And this divergence is not necessarily a problem at first. In fact, it may increase resilience in certain ways, allowing one part of the system to remain stable even if another begins to experience strain. But it also means that alignment becomes more difficult to maintain over time. And alignment, as we've seen throughout this exploration, plays a key role in the stability of complex systems. Which brings us to another important shift: the nature of the military. As pressures along the borders increased, the composition and structure of the Roman army began to change. In the mainstream view, this includes the incorporation of non-Roman soldiers, changes in recruitment practices, and adjustments in how forces were deployed. These changes are often described as practical responses to the realities of the time, the need to maintain defensive strength in the face of evolving challenges. But these adjustments also reflect something deeper, because the military, like any system, is influenced by the environment in which it operates. As conditions change, whether economic, social, or political, the structure of the military adapts accordingly. And over time, these adaptations can alter not just how the military functions, but how it relates to the rest of the system. For example, when recruitment shifts toward different populations, it introduces new perspectives, new expectations, and potentially new dynamics within the army. This is not inherently destabilizing. In many cases, it strengthens the system by increasing flexibility, but it also requires integration, alignment between different groups, consistent training, shared identity. And maintaining that alignment becomes more complex as diversity increases. Not impossible, but requiring additional effort, additional coordination. And this brings us back to a recurring theme, the balance between complexity and coherence. Because as systems grow and adapt, they often become more complex, more layers, more variation, more moving parts. And while this can increase capacity, it can also make it more difficult to maintain a unified direction. Which leads to another subtle observation: the role of perception over time. For individuals living within the later Roman Empire, many of these changes would not have been experienced as a single clear transformation. Instead, they would appear as gradual adjustments, new policies, new structures, shifting patterns of authority. Daily life would continue, markets opening, roads being used, routines maintained. And yet, beneath that continuity, the underlying structure would be evolving. And this creates an interesting contrast. From a distance, history often appears as a sequence of distinct phases: republic, early empire, late empire, decline. But from within the system, those phases are less defined. They blend into one another, connected by continuous experience. And this perspective is important, because it reminds us that systems do not change in isolated moments. They change through accumulation, through countless small adjustments that, over time, create new patterns. And sometimes, those new patterns only become visible when viewed in hindsight. Which brings us to the concept of thresholds, points at which gradual change begins to produce more noticeable effects. Not because something entirely new has appeared, but because the accumulation has reached a level where its impact can no longer be easily absorbed by existing structures. In the context of the Roman Empire, these thresholds may have appeared in different ways. Increased difficulty in maintaining borders, greater economic strain, more frequent political instability. From the mainstream perspective, these are often treated as indicators of decline, but they can also be seen as signals, moments where the system is transitioning from one state to another, not necessarily failing, but changing in ways that alter its ability to maintain previous patterns. And this brings us to a quiet but important question. Was the later Roman Empire becoming weaker, or simply becoming different? Because those two ideas are not always the same. A system can lose certain capabilities while gaining others. It can become less effective in one area, more adaptive in another. And how we interpret those changes often depends on what we expect the system to be. If we expect it to remain as it was, then change appears as decline. But if we view it as an evolving structure, then change becomes something more nuanced. And so, as we continue this exploration, we move closer to the moments that are often described as endpoints, not to redefine them, but to observe them carefully, to understand how they emerge from the processes we've been tracing all along. Because by the time a system reaches what we call an ending, much of the transformation has already taken place, and what remains is not a sudden collapse, but the visible result of changes that have been unfolding quietly for a long time. As we continue moving forward through the long and gradual transformation of the Roman Empire, we begin to approach a point that is often described with a kind of finality, the fall of Rome. But when examined more carefully, that idea of a sudden ending begins to soften, becoming less of a single moment and more of a transition that unfolds unevenly across time and space. Because while the year 476 CE is commonly referenced, associated with the deposition of Romulus Augustulus, what it represents is not the disappearance of a system overnight, but a shift in how that system was organized, experienced, and remembered. In the mainstream understanding, the fall of the Western Roman Empire is explained through a combination of internal and external factors: political instability, economic strain, military challenges, and increasing pressure from various groups beyond the empire's borders, all contributing to a gradual weakening of centralized authority. By the time Romulus Augustulus was removed from power, the structures that once defined the Western Empire had already been under significant strain for decades, if not longer. And this explanation is well supported. But when we slow down and look at what actually changed and what didn't, something more subtle begins to appear. Because the removal of an emperor does not erase roads, cities, or communities. It does not immediately dissolve systems of agriculture, local governance, or trade. People continue to live, work, and interact within the environments they know. In many cases, the transition from Roman to post-Roman rule may have felt less like a dramatic break, and more like a shift in administration. New leaders, new titles, but familiar structures continuing beneath them. And this is where the idea of continuity becomes important. Because while the Western Roman Empire as a centralized political entity came to an end, many of its systems persisted. Local elites maintained influence. Roman law continued to shape legal practices. Infrastructure, though sometimes neglected, remained in use. Even the concept of Rome itself, as an idea, a reference point, continued to carry meaning, which suggests that what we often call the fall may be better understood as a redistribution, power becoming more localized, authority shifting from a central structure to a collection of regional ones. Not a disappearance, but a transformation. And this perspective becomes even clearer when we consider the Eastern Roman Empire, often referred to later as the Byzantine Empire, which continued for nearly another 1,000 years, centered around Constantinople. From a mainstream point of view, this continuation highlights that the Roman system did not simply vanish. It adapted, persisted, and evolved in a different context. But even within the Western regions, where centralized imperial authority declined, elements of Roman structure remained embedded in daily life. And this brings us back to a familiar pattern: that large systems are not defined solely by their leadership, but by the layers beneath. Administrative practices, cultural norms, economic habits, all continuing, sometimes independently, of the structures that originally supported them. And this raises a quiet question: at what point does a system truly end? Is it when its central authority dissolves? When its institutions change? Or when the patterns that define it are no longer recognizable? Because in the case of Rome, those patterns did not disappear immediately. They faded, shifted, blended with new influences, creating something that was no longer fully Roman, but not entirely separate either. And this gradual blending is often less visible in simplified historical narratives, because it doesn't fit easily into clear categories. It is not a clean break, but a transition zone, where elements of the old and the new coexist, sometimes for generations. And within that transition, there are variations. Different regions experience change at different rates. Some areas maintained stronger continuity with Roman practices. Others shifted more quickly, influenced by new political structures or cultural dynamics, which means that the end of the Roman Empire is not a single point on a timeline, but a range of experiences spread across geography and time. And this perspective changes how we think about stability and collapse, because instead of a system failing completely, we see it reorganizing, not always intentionally, not always smoothly, but in ways that allow certain elements to persist while others are replaced. And this leads to another subtle observation: that systems can outlive their own definitions. Even after the structures that once defined them have changed, the patterns they created can continue to influence what comes next. In the case of Rome, this influence is visible in law, language, architecture, governance, elements that continue to shape societies long after the empire itself is no longer present in its original form. And this continuity suggests that the legacy of a system is not limited to its lifespan. It extends into the structures that follow, sometimes clearly, sometimes in ways that are more difficult to trace. Which brings us back to the idea of perception. From a modern perspective, it is tempting to look for clear beginnings and endings, defined moments that mark the rise and fall of civilizations. But when viewed more closely, those moments often represent transitions rather than conclusions. And within those transitions, there is complexity, layers of continuity and change, interacting over time, creating outcomes that are not always predictable, but rarely abrupt. And so, as we approach what is often considered the end of the Western Roman Empire, it becomes less about identifying a single point of collapse, and more about understanding the processes that led to transformation. Processes that we've been tracing throughout this exploration. Patterns of stability, adaptation, pressure, and adjustment. And from here, we begin to move into the final layers of this journey. Not to summarize, but to reflect more broadly on what the Roman Empire represents as a system, how its patterns can be observed, not only in history, but in other complex structures, and what can be quietly learned by looking at it in this way. As we continue moving through the final layers of the Roman Empire, it becomes useful to step slightly outside of the timeline, not to leave the historical record behind, but to observe it from a wider angle. Because once the immediate sequence of events begins to settle, the rise, the expansion, the adaptation, the transformation, what remains are patterns. Patterns that are not limited to Rome itself, but appear in different forms across other complex systems, quietly repeating, sometimes in ways that are easy to recognize, and sometimes in ways that are less obvious. In the mainstream understanding, Rome is often treated as a unique case, a civilization that achieved a particular scale and longevity, shaped by specific historical conditions. And that is certainly true. The geography of the Mediterranean, the political developments of the Republic, the innovations in engineering and administration, all contributed to a structure that was distinct in its time. But at the same time, when you look closely at how that structure functioned, it begins to feel less isolated, because many of the processes we've explored, expansion through integration, stability through shared systems, adaptation in response to pressure, gradual transformation over time, these are not exclusive to Rome. They are characteristics of complex systems more broadly. And this is where the perspective begins to shift. Because instead of asking only what Rome was, we can begin to ask how it behaved. Not in a human sense, but in a structural one. How it responded to change, how it maintained coherence across distance, how it balanced stability with adaptability. And when we look at it this way, certain patterns become more noticeable. For example, the relationship between growth and complexity. In the early stages of expansion, growth often brings increased capability, more resources, more connections, more influence. But as that growth continues, complexity increases as well. More regions to manage, more interactions to coordinate, more variation to account for. And at a certain point, managing that complexity becomes a central challenge. In Rome's case, we saw this reflected in administrative reforms, in the division of the empire, in the gradual layering of systems designed to maintain control. These were not signs of immediate failure, but responses to the natural consequences of scale. And this pattern, growth leading to complexity, complexity requiring adaptation, appears in many different contexts. Not just in empires, but in organizations, networks, and even ecosystems. And then there is the pattern of alignment. Throughout the earlier parts of this exploration, we noticed how different layers of the Roman system, military, legal, economic, cultural, worked together in ways that created stability. Not perfectly, not without tension, but with enough consistency to maintain coherence. And this alignment did not happen automatically. It was supported by shared practices, repeated experiences, and distributed decision-making that generally followed similar patterns. But as systems evolve, maintaining alignment becomes more difficult. Variation increases. Local conditions diverge. New influences enter the system, and gradually, the degree of alignment can begin to shift. Not disappearing entirely, but becoming less uniform. And when that happens, the system does not necessarily collapse, but it begins to operate differently. Which brings us to another pattern, the difference between visible and invisible structures. In Rome, the visible structures are easy to identify. Roads, buildings, laws, political offices. These are the elements that are most often described in historical narratives. But beneath them, there are less visible processes, informal networks, shared assumptions, routines and habits that guide behavior without explicit instruction. And these invisible structures often play a significant role in maintaining stability, because they operate continuously, not only during moments of crisis or decision, but in the everyday functioning of the system. And when these underlying processes begin to change, the effects may not be immediately visible, but they can influence the system over time, which leads to a quieter observation. That understanding a system fully requires looking at both what is clearly documented and what is implied by the outcomes we observe. Not to replace evidence with speculation, but to recognize that not all processes leave direct traces. And this perspective becomes especially relevant when we consider the idea of endings. Because as we've seen, the end of the Western Roman Empire is not a single moment, but a transition. A redistribution of structures, a transformation of patterns, and this kind of ending, gradual, uneven, layered, is characteristic of many complex systems. They do not simply stop, they evolve into something else. And in that evolution, elements of the original system continue to influence what follows, sometimes clearly, sometimes in more subtle ways. Which brings us to a final, more reflective question. Not about Rome specifically, but about how we interpret systems in general. Do we tend to focus on moments, key events, turning points, clear transitions? Or do we look at processes, the gradual changes that lead to those moments? Because both perspectives are valid, but they highlight different aspects of the same reality. And in the case of Rome, focusing on processes reveals a structure that is less about sudden change and more about continuous adaptation. A system that maintained coherence not through static stability, but through ongoing adjustment. And this understanding does not replace the traditional narrative. It complements it, adding depth to what we already know, and opening space for further reflection. And as we move toward the final parts of this exploration, we begin to bring these patterns together, not to form a single conclusion, but to observe how they interact, how they create a picture that is both familiar and, in some ways, quietly different from what we might have expected at the beginning. As we move further into the final stretch of this quiet exploration of the Roman Empire, it becomes useful to turn our attention towards something that is often discussed only after everything else: legacy. Not in the sense of monuments or ruins alone, but in the deeper patterns that continue long after a system has changed form. Because if we step away from the idea of Rome as something that simply existed and then ended, and instead view it as a process that transformed, then what follows becomes just as important as what came before. In the mainstream understanding, the legacy of Rome is extensive and well documented. Roman law influenced later legal systems across Europe. Latin evolved into the Romance languages. Architectural techniques and urban planning principles continued to shape cities long after the empire's political structures had faded. Roads, where maintained, continued to guide movement. Concepts of governance, administration, and citizenship carried forward in different forms. These are the visible continuities, the elements that can be traced directly, supported by evidence, studied and compared. But when you begin to look more closely, there are also less visible forms of continuity, not in the sense of hidden knowledge, but in the persistence of patterns. Because systems leave behind more than structures. They leave behind ways of organizing, ways of thinking, ways of interacting that can continue even when their original context has changed. And this becomes particularly interesting when we consider how Roman systems were absorbed into what followed. After the decline of centralized authority in the West, various successor kingdoms emerged. These new political structures did not begin from nothing. They inherited landscapes shaped by Roman infrastructure, populations accustomed to certain administrative practices, and cultural frameworks that had developed over centuries. From a mainstream perspective, this is often described as continuity within transformation, and that's accurate. But it also suggests that the Roman system did not simply pass on its components. It influenced how new systems were formed. Because when a new structure emerges within an environment shaped by an older one, it is, to some extent, guided by that environment. Not determined by it, but influenced. And this influence can be subtle. It can appear in the layout of settlements, in the organization of authority, in the expectations people have about governance and order, not always consciously recognized, but present in the background. And this brings us to another layer: memory. Not memory as recorded history alone, but as collective awareness. Stories, traditions, references to Rome as a point of comparison, all contributing to how later societies understood themselves. Even when direct continuity was limited, the idea of Rome remained, sometimes as a model, sometimes as a contrast, sometimes as something to be rediscovered or reinterpreted. And this idea, Rome as a reference point, has persisted for centuries. Empires and states have looked back to it, drawing inspiration, identifying parallels, or simply acknowledging its place in the broader arc of history, which suggests that the legacy of a system is not only in what it leaves behind physically, but in how it continues to shape perception, how it becomes part of the framework through which later systems are understood. And this leads to a quieter observation, that the influence of a system can extend beyond its direct existence, into the way future systems think about themselves. And then there is the question of what is not preserved, because while many aspects of Roman life have left traces, others have not. Practices that were routine at the time may not have been recorded in detail. Informal systems, local variations, everyday interactions, these are often only partially visible in the historical record. And this creates gaps, not gaps that necessarily hide something dramatic, but gaps that remind us that our understanding is always incomplete, which, in turn, invites careful speculation, not to fill those gaps with assumptions, but to acknowledge that complex systems often rely on elements that are so embedded in daily life that they are rarely documented explicitly. And when those elements are lost, what remains can sometimes appear more structured, more defined than it actually was. Which brings us back to a recurring theme throughout this exploration, that what we see, the visible structures, the recorded events, are only part of the system. Beneath them are layers of interaction, adaptation, and experience that are more difficult to capture, but just as important. And when we consider the legacy of Rome in this way, it becomes less about identifying specific influences and more about recognizing patterns that continue to appear. Patterns of organization, integration, adaptation, all evolving in new contexts. And this perspective does not change what Rome was, but it changes how we relate to it. Not as something distant and separate, but as part of a larger continuity of systems that extend across time, which leads to a final, more reflective space. Because by now, after moving through the different layers, military, governance, economy, space, belief, daily life, pressure, transformation, the Roman Empire begins to feel less like a fixed object and more like a process that can be observed not only in its specific details, but in the way those details interact. And within that process, there is a kind of quiet coherence, not perfect, not unchanging, but persistent enough to sustain itself for centuries. And even after that coherence shifts, its influence continues. And so, as we approach the final parts of this journey, the focus becomes less about discovering something hidden and more about noticing what has been there all along. Patterns that repeat, structures that adapt, systems that evolve, and the subtle ways in which they continue to shape what comes next. As we move closer to the final layers of this exploration of the Roman Empire, it becomes useful to pause in a more reflective space. Not to summarize too quickly, but to sit with the patterns that have been unfolding quietly across everything we've looked at so far. Because by now, the empire no longer appears simply as a sequence of events. It begins to feel more like a structure that existed in motion, something that was continuously adjusting, even during its most stable periods. In the mainstream understanding, Rome is often divided into clear phases: Republic, early empire, later empire, decline. These divisions are useful. They help organize a vast amount of information into something more manageable. But they can also give the impression that history moves in distinct steps, that one phase ends before another begins. And yet, when we've looked more closely, what becomes noticeable is how much overlap exists between those phases. Elements of the Republic continue into the Empire. Structures of stability remain during periods of pressure. Patterns of adaptation begin long before they are fully recognized, which suggests that the boundaries we draw are, in some ways, simplifications, helpful, but not entirely reflective of how the system actually experienced itself. Because systems don't experience themselves in categories, they experience themselves in continuity. And this continuity is made up of countless small interactions, decisions, adjustments, routines, each one relatively minor on its own, but together forming the larger pattern that we later describe as history. And this leads to a subtle shift in perspective. Instead of asking when Rome changed, we begin to ask how it was always changing, not in dramatic ways, but in the steady accumulation of small variations. And this idea becomes especially interesting when we consider stability. Because throughout this exploration, stability has appeared not as something fixed, but as something maintained, a result of alignment between different layers: military, economic, social, cultural, all interacting in ways that allow the system to continue functioning. But maintaining that alignment requires constant adjustment, and adjustment introduces variation, which means that even during periods we describe as stable, change is still happening, quietly, continuously. And over time, those small changes begin to shift the overall structure, not abruptly, but gradually enough that they can go unnoticed until a certain threshold is reached. And this brings us back to the idea of perception. Because how a system is perceived, both from within and from outside, influences how its changes are interpreted. From within, gradual change can feel like continuity. From outside, looking back, it can appear as transformation. And both perspectives are valid, but they highlight different aspects of the same process. Which leads to another quiet observation. That much of what we describe as historical change is not about what happens, but about when we choose to notice it. And in the case of Rome, many of the processes that led to what we call its end were present long before that moment was identified. They were simply part of the ongoing adjustments that the system was making. And this idea extends beyond Rome itself, because when we look at other complex systems, whether in history or in the present, similar patterns appear. Growth leading to complexity, complexity requiring adaptation, adaptation introducing variation, variation gradually shifting the structure, not in a way that guarantees a particular outcome, but in a way that makes change inevitable over time. And this perspective does not reduce the significance of Rome. If anything, it deepens it, because it allows us to see the empire not just as a unique case, but as an example of how systems behave under sustained scale and complexity. And within that example, there are insights that feel quietly relevant, not as direct comparisons, but as patterns that can be recognized in different contexts. Which brings us to another layer, the idea of inevitability. It is sometimes suggested, in a simplified way, that the fall of Rome was inevitable. that any system of that size would eventually decline. But when we look more closely, inevitability becomes a more nuanced concept, because while certain pressures may be common, how a system responds to them can vary. Different choices, different conditions, different moments of adaptation, all influencing the path that is taken. And so, rather than viewing Rome's transformation as inevitable in a fixed sense, it may be more accurate to see it as one possible outcome among many, shaped by the specific interactions of its time. And this keeps the focus where it has been throughout this exploration, on processes rather than conclusions, on patterns rather than singular explanations. And within that focus, there is a kind of calm clarity, not because everything is fully understood, but because the complexity is allowed to exist without being forced into a single narrative. And so, as we move toward the final part, the goal is not to close the discussion with a definitive answer, but to leave space for reflection, to allow the patterns we've observed, the structures, the interactions, the gradual shifts, to settle into place, not as something to memorize, but as something to quietly consider. Because sometimes, understanding does not come from resolving every question, but from seeing how the questions themselves connect. And in the case of the Roman Empire, those connections extend far beyond any single moment in time. As we move into the final stretch of this quiet exploration of the Roman Empire, it becomes less about adding new pieces, and more about allowing everything we've already observed to settle into a clearer shape. Not a rigid conclusion, but a kind of understanding that emerges when patterns are viewed together rather than in isolation. Because by now, the empire no longer appears as a single story. It feels more like a layered system, one that existed not only through its visible structures, but through the continuous interaction of elements that were often subtle, sometimes hidden in plain sight. In the mainstream narrative, Rome's story is often told with a beginning, a rise, a peak, and a fall. This structure is useful. It gives clarity, direction, a sense of movement through time. But throughout this exploration, what has quietly appeared is something slightly different. Not a straight line, but a kind of ongoing balance between forces, expansion and integration, stability and adaptation, structure and flexibility. And within each of these, there is no fixed endpoint, only a continuous adjustment. Because when Rome expanded, it did not simply grow, it absorbed, adapted, reorganized. When it stabilized, it did not become static. It maintained alignment through constant small changes. And when pressures began to build, the system did not immediately collapse. It adjusted again, redistributing strain, evolving in response to new conditions. And this pattern, adjustment rather than abrupt change, appears again and again, which leads to a quieter way of understanding what we often call decline. Instead of imagining a strong system suddenly becoming weak, it may be more accurate to see a system that is gradually shifting its balance, sometimes successfully, sometimes less so, until the original form is no longer maintained. Not because it failed in a single moment, but because the accumulation of changes has created something different. And this difference can be difficult to notice from within. Because for individuals living inside the system, daily life continues. Routines remain. Familiar structures are still present, even if they are changing slowly. The sense of continuity can persist long after the underlying structure has begun to transform. And this is where perspective becomes important. From within, change feels gradual. From outside, looking back, it can appear sudden. And both perspectives are valid, but they highlight different aspects of the same process. Which brings us to another subtle point, that systems are not defined only by what they are, but by how they are experienced. For a citizen of Rome in its earlier periods, the empire may have felt expansive, organized, full of opportunity. For someone living centuries later, in a more localized context, the experience might have felt more fragmented, yet still connected to familiar structures. And in both cases, the system exists, not as a fixed entity, but as a lived reality. And this lived reality is shaped by patterns that are often too subtle to be fully captured in broad historical summaries. Patterns of behavior, patterns of expectation, patterns of interaction that repeat daily, shaping how individuals relate to the larger structure. And when those patterns begin to shift, even slightly, they can influence the system over time in ways that are difficult to measure directly, but visible in the outcomes, which leads to a final quiet reflection before we reach the end. That understanding a system like the Roman Empire may not come from identifying a single cause or a single moment of change, but from observing how many different elements interact across time, how visible structures depend on less visible processes, how stability depends on continuous adjustment, how change emerges not from isolated events, but from accumulation. And when all of these observations are held together, the picture that forms is not one of mystery in the dramatic sense, but of complexity in a calm, steady way, a system that functioned, adapted, and transformed, not perfectly, not without tension, but with enough coherence to persist far longer than many others. And even after that persistence changed form, its influence continued, not as a single legacy, but as a collection of patterns that extend beyond the boundaries of its own timeline. And so, as we approach the final part, the goal is not to resolve everything into a simple explanation, but to allow that complexity to remain, to recognize that some systems are best understood not by reducing them, but by observing them patiently, layer by layer, and to carry that perspective forward, not just as a way of understanding Rome, but as a way of thinking more broadly about how complex systems exist, change, and continue in different forms. As we reach the final part of this long, quiet exploration of the Roman Empire, it becomes clear that there isn't a single point where everything resolves. No final answer that neatly explains how something so vast could rise, stabilize, transform, and continue to echo long after its original form shifted. And in a way, that absence of a simple conclusion feels appropriate, because everything we've moved through has suggested the same underlying idea, that Rome was never just one thing to fully define, but a system in motion, constantly shaped by the interaction of its many layers. If we return for a moment to the beginning, to that familiar image of Rome as a powerful, organized empire built on military strength, engineering, and governance, that image still holds true. The mainstream understanding has not been replaced or undone. Roads were built, laws were written, armies were disciplined, and administrative systems were carefully structured. These are not theories or interpretations. They are supported, visible, and well established. But what has quietly expanded over the course of this journey is not the list of facts, but the way those facts connect. Because each piece, the military, the economy, the governance, the belief systems, the daily routines, does not exist in isolation. They form a network, one that depends on alignment, on repetition, on the subtle reinforcement of patterns over time. And when that network is functioning well, stability emerges, not as something fixed, but as something continuously maintained. And this idea, stability as an active process rather than a passive state, may be one of the most important threads running beneath everything we've explored, because it shifts the way we think about both the strength and the transformation of Rome. It suggests that what made the empire resilient was not just its visible structures, but its ability to adapt, to adjust without losing coherence, to absorb change without immediately fragmenting. And at the same time, it suggests that the eventual transformation of that system was not a sudden failure, but the result of those same processes continuing over time, gradually reshaping the structure into something new. Which brings us back, one final time, to the idea of endings. Because if we look at Rome not as a static object, but as a process, then its end becomes less about disappearance and more about transition. The deposition of Romulus Augustulus remains a useful historical marker, a point that signals a shift in political structure. But it does not represent the vanishing of everything that came before it. Instead, it marks a moment when the patterns we've been observing, the adjustments, the redistributions, the gradual changes, reach a point where they are recognized as something different. And even then, the system continues, just in altered forms. Roman law influences future legal systems. Infrastructure continues to shape movement and settlement. Cultural patterns remain embedded in language, in traditions, in ways of organizing society, not as exact replicas, but as echoes. And those echoes are not always obvious. They exist in the background, in the assumptions that later systems inherit without always tracing their origins, in the familiarity of certain structures, certain ideas, certain ways of thinking about order and organization. And this is where the exploration quietly opens outward. Because once you begin to see Rome in this way, not only as a historical empire, but as an example of how complex systems behave, it becomes possible to notice similar patterns elsewhere. Not in a direct comparison, but in the repetition of certain dynamics. Growth leading to complexity, complexity requiring adaptation, adaptation introducing variation, variation gradually reshaping the structure. And within that cycle, continuity and change existing at the same time. Which means that the study of Rome becomes something slightly different. Not just an examination of the past, but a way of observing how systems function more broadly. And this does not require speculation beyond what we've seen. It remains grounded in the evidence, in the patterns that are visible when we look carefully enough. But it also leaves space for reflection, because not every detail is fully known, not every process is completely documented, and within those gaps, there is room not for dramatic conclusions, but for quiet curiosity, for the recognition that even well-studied systems can contain layers that are not immediately visible, and that understanding often comes not from forcing those layers into clear definitions, but from allowing them to remain complex. And so, as this exploration comes to a close, there is no need to resolve every question. Instead, there is a sense of stepping back, seeing the Roman Empire not just as a distant chapter in history, but as a structure that still, in subtle ways, shapes how systems are built, understood, and experienced. A system that was never entirely static, never entirely unified, never entirely gone, just continuously transforming across time, across perspective, across the quiet space between what is clearly known and what can still be thoughtfully considered. And perhaps that is the most consistent pattern of all, not the rise or the fall, but the continuity that exists between them.